What if I told you some stories you need to hear to believe?
A top boxing contender coming inside the walls of a prison to fight an inmate.
Everyone wanted this t-shirt. They wanted to be associated with the Yankee Suck movement.
I was scared for my life. I honestly thought I was going to die in the Arctic.
It was a brilliant thing. Put $2 million into the cage on deposit and they'll do pretty much whatever you ask.
At that moment, I wanted to turn to somebody and say, help me.
The all-new 30 for 30 podcast. Subscribe now on the ESPN app or Apple Podcasts.
Say whatever you want about sports. Say whatever you want about their problems, their contradictions, their imperfections. But always remember one thing, sports bring us together.
Becoming a Bears fan starts at birth.
Section 250 is a very tight-knit group. We're the core.
It's the experience of going every single week.
Sylvia, stop them!
Good morning, you're on the trading post. Go ahead, please.
I have for sale some ramps.
Yep, thank you. Do you know anybody that's a Chicago Bears fan?
How would you gamble?
Just a dinner.
What's the dollar amount on that?
$200.
Family is extremely important. It's the core and the foundation for who we are.
I do talk about the Bears a lot.
My kids learned most of the swear words from me watching Bears games.
Yes. My wedding day is a huge part of my life. If Mike is watching the Cubs game, I'd be very, very angry.
For the Cubs to go to the World Series, I think we're going to find a way to get a TV and celebrate if they win that game.
This is Section 250, a story about faith, family, and the fans around you.
Section 250 is just,
Hi, everybody. I'm Chuck Salter with Fast Company. I really feel like I should start with, what if I told you? We're going to tell the story behind all these amazing pieces here. Well, that's what we're going to attempt to do. I feel like in the title, we're talking about the connected fan, but really we're talking about connected consumers. Because I feel like what the lessons we're going to draw from this today is really affecting every industry. You know, how you're adapting to change, whether you're a media company or a brand. Increasingly, the audience is younger, it's more digital, it's more mobile. And I feel like ESPN reacts really well to this. We produced this issue called Most Innovative Companies in Business at Fast Company, And ESPN is, not every year, but usually, it's a usual suspect, in that list for good reason, and really often for the adaptive storytelling. I feel like that's kind of what I take away from seeing that video is all the different mediums that you guys are using and the different ways you're approaching stories. I want to start with this question of how ESPN is changing. What are the one or two trends that you find are fundamentally changing your business, how you tell stories, how you conceive of those stories? Chad, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. Well, I oversee our digital content for domestic. And the areas in which we really need to be thinking about right now are how we're serving fans in what we consider to be a live window. And for us, live isn't just about the 3 or 4 hours of a game experience. It's what happens in a breaking news environment, what happens in a tentpole day like July 1st is going to be the start of NBA free agency. That is a massive day for sports fans. And sort of this window of mid-June to early July for the NBA is as exciting as it gets for sports fans. And that's all live. And so how are we delivering the most context, the most information, the most color, the best video, the best photos, in short bites that are as informative as possible and getting them onto our platforms as quickly as possible, whether it be through the digital space or information and video that's coming in that we then disseminate throughout the rest of sort of the ESPN ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Allison, how about you?
So I oversee the magazine as well as ESPNW, and it's an interesting thing to have one foot in both worlds because ESPNW is a digital first platform, magazine obviously print. What I do is so interconnected with what Chad does that, to a certain extent, my answer to that question is, whatever he said. Because the point is that our fans and our readers want to get what they want to get at the moment they want to get it. So we need to be thinking about how do we make that experience seamless, whether a story begins in the pages of the magazine and lives in all these other places, or whether it begins in the hour after a game finishes and then there's an arc of that story that ends up finding its way back into print. But I think as the fan gets ever more connected and ever more mobile, as you were saying, despite our joke that the magazine is the other mobile device.
I'm holding your mobile device right here. Yeah. Here you go.
What it's done is for us, it forces us to think very hard constantly about what can we do in the particular platform that we're creating in that is very unique and specific to that experience. So for the magazine, we think a lot about, when is a cover the best possible screen for a particular kind of sports conversation? Can we make a storytelling statement, a creative statement with our covers that actually starts conversations among fans? I think a lot about social media as our modern newsstand. It's where the conversations are happening. It's where people are sharing things. It's where things get started that then end up bringing readers back around to have this particular kind of experience in print when they're ready to have that kind of immersive reading experience.
So is it hard for you just as a magazine editor to decide on one image, one story to tell on that cover, as opposed to what happens in social media where it's just a never-ending stream of cover stories?
It is and it isn't because we think really hard about, because we have a certain life cycle, we know that we're coming out every 2 to 3 weeks. We need to be thinking about what is the conversation that's going to be so paramount that it's lasting over that lifespan. So I think across ESPN, we think in different kinds of time windows. There's the type of conversation that you're having second by second with your friends when you're texting back and forth and you're sharing stuff on Twitter. There's the kind of conversation that you're having over the lifespan of a day when you're digesting, everything that happened from last night's games. And then there's a different kind of conversation that's happening over a matter of weeks where it's more thematic. It's longer range, and then there's a totally different kind of conversation that's going to happen, over the course of a year when you have a film to think about.
Mm-hmm. All right, so Libby, we've talked about digital, we've talked about print digital, now we're segueing to ESPN Films and podcast.
Sure.
Podcast.
Yeah, I think as we talk about change and evolution, I see our group looking similarly to the magazine, I guess, is how can we make really great tentpole events throughout the year. We are not doing what Chad does. We're not reacting to news right away. So we have a year or 2 or 3 to plan these stories out. So what will people be talking about, in a year or 2 years from the start of the college football season? How can we get the company to surround a specific story and get excited about? And how can we make this easy for the magazine or the rest of the company? So we spend a lot of time and money on one story, and it's our job to, as I said, sort of make this easy for the rest of the company to get behind and make an event. So I think I've seen all of us work more closely recently in saying, okay, what are stories that we're going to care about over the course of the next 1, 2, 3 years, and how can we all get behind it? So these are bigger tent poles and less, so that we're not in competition with each other. We're working, towards the same goal.
Right. That I feel like is the trick, right? I mean, you have so many platforms, and ultimately you guys are, I feel like are so good at is taking that idea and having it play out in the different platform in different ways. Mm-hmm. And you see different companies struggling with that, where they'll just kind of repeat the story, same story, different format, and it doesn't work as well. Alice and I were talking about that before. What have you guys discovered? What's the key to that sort of collaboration?
Oh, I think it's endemic in the culture. I don't think anyone thinks of an idea and doesn't think they have an opportunity and a responsibility to get that idea disseminated to as many people in other parts of the company as possible. One, because we get excited about our ideas, and if you're going to be at ESPN, that's one of the values and benefits and coolest things about the company is it has a huge platform, right? And so if we have an idea in one place, how can we get other people excited about that idea in another place, and how can we get other people excited about that idea in another place? And the more we can sort of get people involved at the moment of creation, the more we can get people thinking about what is the idea that can work well on my platform from a different perspective. Mm-hmm. I don't think any of us, we've all sort of had to manage huge cross-platform projects. The best ones always work out where we try not to have too much sort of ownership over how things are going to look, and we just put the idea out there. And I don't say this to sort of to make it sound utopian, because it takes a lot of work and effort, and there's a lot of conversations, but the more people can think about, all right, here's the germ of the idea, and then get everybody in the room and say, take it, go with it. If we're all excited about it, do what works best for your platform, do what works best for your platform, and let's try to make sure we coordinate on the timing and the resources and sort of the conversation we're all having. So what ultimately ends up being is huge and enormous and powerful and can have an impact on sports fans and then sort of the culture writ large.
So Allison, what does that look like practically from something like the baseball experience? When did you guys share the germ of an idea? Because I always find that's a dangerous moment from like a content creator standpoint. Because it's when all of a sudden your idea gets out into the world, maybe before it's really kind of ready for everybody else to grab it and put it on their platforms to figure out what it is, but you kind of have to trust the organization and your colleagues to do that well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's actually a great example. I think it was almost exactly a year ago. So our digital lead baseball editor and the magazine lead baseball editor were having conversations, I think in the early part of last summer. They were essentially trying to think about how to construct the storytelling that they were doing in baseball last summer. And at a certain point they said, we need to look at the fact that, a full third of Major League Baseball players are Hispanic. And there are these interesting things happening where there's really no front office representation that's Latino in Major League Baseball. When you look at stories about players coming from Asia, coming from other places, you'll see stories on a regular basis of, this person has a translator assigned to travel with them. There's storytelling about the fact that person, has someone walking them through integration into American culture. What about all the guys who are coming over from the Dominican Republic, from Cuba, from Puerto Rico, from wherever, where they're not being afforded that kind of opportunity and experience? And essentially their experience here in the US is largely determined by which market they land in. Do they land in a community that is, bilingual or not? Are they in a large market? Are they landing in a place where, there is a long history of other players coming in who can very quickly show them the ropes or not? So anyway, they started saying, these are stories that should be told. And how do we embrace that? Because, by the way, the baseball fan base, mirrors what's happening, across our entire, U.S. Demographic community. So anyway, they're having these conversations, and at some point it bubbles to me, and I was thinking, so who have we started talking to about this at the company? And as Chad mentioned, it's really about a commitment and a decision in our culture that we're going to surround and embrace, all stories in this way. So probably our number one job as leaders of the different groups we're in is to have that moment where you press pause and you say, so who's been in the conversation? And at that point, we started pulling in all sorts of folks. It was, have you looped in somebody from photo? Because this feels like a really dramatic photo storytelling opportunity. Who are we talking to in video? Is it digital video? Have we started talking to television? Who is involved from Deportes? Who's involved from SportsCenter? Who's involved from Baseball Esta Noche? Who's involved from, and the list goes on and on. At this
is a
point,
long email thread.
It's a very,
I have to say, this is like,
I was
and
gonna
Chad
say,
said he spends as much, I'll let you say it, but I was struck by how much time you spend on the names for an email.
We talked about this sort of in our pre-conversation, but I spend as much time trying to figure out who's going to be on an email than actually typing the email. Yeah. And inevitably, I will forget people almost every single time, and then I'll be like, oh, fuck. And then I'll have to forward the email to somebody, and I'm going to be like, I'm so sorry, I meant to include you on this email, and you just forget, and it's frustrating. But that's the challenge of being at a big company is you got a lot of people you got to tell.
Yeah.
And
at
then
this point, there's a weekly gathering of, I want to say there's probably 60 people on the invite, but probably for baseball experience, but a working group of probably 30 people who gather on a weekly basis. And they're looking at story ideas, they're looking at programming, calendaring decisions about where things are going to land. Some of the stories that our deputy editor, Paul Kicks, who's been captaining the whole program, he said there was one day where E60 had decided that a story wasn't going to be ready to land on that particular date that they had committed to. And the decision from E60 to slide a feature to a different week had a cascade effect that ended up hitting, 6 or 7 other shows, platforms, groups, because all of these stories were linked, with rollout dates on a certain kind of schedule.
Right, it becomes this delicate architecture of the timing and everything. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, everybody bought in and said, this is a huge idea. And it's hugely important for the storytelling in the sport, but it's hugely important also for our fans. So, I want to say it was probably in November that we brought our sales and marketing staff on board, and so they're also part of these calls so that they understand, how we're rolling out storytelling. And, we're hoping this is a season-long storytelling program that started, digitally. It's been across most of our television properties. We have a dedicated issue of the magazine, and we've done, episodic storytelling in every issue of the magazine since April. But we're hoping that it doesn't end this year. And so this working group of, 30, 40, 50 people that we have involved, this should be something that then spins off more exciting things for next season and beyond.
How many projects do you have like that have, I think you told me that this one has it has a Slack group, Slack channel dedicated to it. How many of these exist? There are these kind of big story ideas that become almost like tentpole issues.
So we do this. We do this for every major sport because we look at previews, and season previews, playoff previews, draft previews. We kind of think about them in the same way. So I would say those are kind of our baseline. And then this year, baseball experience is new. Body is certainly one of those. The World Fame 100 has become one of those.
Okay.
That was new last year. We probably have the entertainment issue is becoming that way. Our analytics issue. For us, Section 250, We the Fans was like that. I feel like there's probably half a dozen of those going on any given year.
Okay. Libby, what strikes me about some of this, kind of connecting some of the threads, is that some you can plan for. You kind of recognize, oh, this is a big thing and everything. Others, looking back, now I'm talking about the OJ Made in America series, that we look at it now as this finished product, this Oscar-winning documentary, the first for ESPN, but you look back to the beginning of it, and how did that one start? Did it start with that sort of grand plan, or did it start as, this is another great 30 for 30 hour-long doc?
I think it was a mix of those two. I think we first approached Ezra Edelman, who directed that film. My boss, Connor Shell, had always thought that OJ resonated. And yes, a lot had been obviously covered on him, but the context of the response to the verdict and the story that people already knew was untold. So we approached Ezra about a film that we thought could warrant 4 hours. I think our contract was officially at that. But over time, he obviously took that story to places that we didn't imagine he would take them to. So I remember the first rough cut screening, we tell the story a lot, at the ABC screening room. Caroline, their producer, called and said, I think we're a little fat, we're a little long. And I was like, oh God, okay, what does that mean? Already it's a 4-hour screening. So we brought our notebooks, we were ready to scrap and tell them what to cut out. And I think it was about 7.5 hours later, we were like, oh shit, I have more, there are rabbit holes they didn't go down. And we kind of looked at each other and knew. But that's what's so great about having the flexibility that we do. There wasn't a set air date, there wasn't a set program. We didn't only think of it as this has to fill 2 nights on TV. It was kind of like, Connor and I always said, we'll make this as good as it can and we'll figure it out. And so that made it harder, obviously, for a lot of reasons, and more expensive than we expected and longer. But being in a position that we're in, which has that kind of flexibility, I think is so special and allowed that to have the life that it did.
So then how do you decide when to kind of send that big message, the group email thread,
we also
to then get
task
support?
Force.
What?
We had a task force. Yes, very
better name,
networky.
much better name.
Yeah. Those poor people every 2 weeks. But we did the same thing. I mean, once we knew, okay, how and when are we getting this on the air? We had a schedule, and with the help of 20 or 30 people, we all sat down and said, okay, what can the magazine do? I think we know where the Bronco is. Who on Chad's team can go tell that story? And then, of course, it was how do we get people to talk about this thing, and what do we do with it? And we know this is great, but we needed the help of people that we didn't even know we needed their help in the beginning, and that's how it sort of snowballed and grew and grew and grew. So we knew we were good at the festivals, and we knew we could handle the straight film side of things, but without the support of ESPN and the buzz and the snowball effect of it, obviously, we wouldn't have gone nearly as far as we did.
I will say it does require more than sort of Slack channels and emails. Like, it's you have to be a zealot for the product that you're trying to push.
Yeah.
And like, I know that there was a time in the spring where any single time I showed up in any meeting or saw anybody walking around campus or in the cafeteria, they were like, hey, how's We the Fans? And like, I kind of started to feel like an idiot because I'm like, oh my God, I'm the crazy person who has been like on top of people nonstop to push this particular project that sort of has a little momentum around the company. And I'm sure like Allie feels the same way about Body and baseball, and Libby I know felt the same way about OJ. It's like you sort of like you take on the persona of that particular project, and there's so much goodwill at ESPN to do it, but everyone has so much stuff to do.
Right.
Like if you are not the
How do you get used to bubble up?
If you are not the person who's going to stay focused on the ball and advocate for your stuff that is important to you, even though everybody knows it's their responsibility and they want to help, you still need to be the person who's in people's grill.
In a funny way, that's the litmus test, right? Because in a world where there's so much going on, if Chad is that passionate about something that he's going to be, driving home that opportunity and that message, it's important because he's not going to do that for everything. So, I mean, the reason I remember the moment that I heard about Baseball Experience was because I was 7.5 months pregnant, and I was like counting down the days of, oh God, what do I have to get done before I'm going to disappear for a while? And I heard about that idea, and I just thought, well, I have to get this on everyone's radar before I go away because I do not want this to get lost in 3 months of nobody banging on doors and saying, hey guys, this is a big deal, this is big. So I remember all the meetings where I was bringing it up and making sure people had heard about it and saying, you're going to be hearing from Paul, you're going to be hearing from Christina, make sure that you embrace this when it comes around, this is big for us.
So you become the champion for it, the evangelist for it, but are you also the, in my mind, when I hear all the different ways that an idea will play out in different formats and different platforms, I keep thinking, well, is there kind of a central person, central group that's saying, that has that map, that has that schedule of when things are going to run and what form they're going to take and how that story's evolved. With We the Fan, who ultimately, like, you're contacting everybody, and then it's a little bit of a paradox where you're controlling the overall kind of vision for it, but then you're letting everybody make it their own.
Yeah, I mean, it's a balance, right? And you don't want to be so obnoxiously pushy that you're telling people what it has to be. You want to say, hey, we have these assets, and we have this opportunity, and we have this timing. I know this, We the Fans.
Real quick, a description of that for everybody. This was one section.
This was We the Fans was sort of an 8-episode series we did that was basically a reality series about this section of passionate fans and one section who came together as a community through no other reason than sort of a shared passion for the Chicago Bears, and they were all longtime season ticket holders. And the idea really began as we wanted to do something that had everybody involved from the creation. So it really didn't start out as anything other than an idea. And
you sent out literally right after you had a lunch that
we had
this idea.
Me and a colleague had a lunch, and we talked about this idea, and I went back to my hotel. It was the ESPYs, and I had just actually seen Libby like in the morning, and she was talking about something going on with the ESPYs, and we were talking about OJ, I think. I don't remember exactly, but like I remember thinking like, OJ's pretty cool. And so then I sent this email in the afternoon, like to a whole bunch of people, and Libby was on there, and Allie was on there, and said, hey, let's try to figure something out if people are into it. And people responded, they were into it. And so a week later, when we were back in Connecticut, we got everyone in a room, and but it was people from films, it was people from SportsCenter, it was people from magazine, people from digital, people from programming, people from marketing, and like all sort of talking about it. And these things are always crazy because everyone comes in amped about an idea, and then 20 minutes in, like the idea veers to the right, and you're like, oh crap, like it's not anywhere close to sort of where we thought it was going to go, and then all of a sudden it veers all the way over here, and then you're like, why are we even having this meeting and talking about it anymore? And then like in the end, everyone was like, you know what, let's just do what we started talking about originally. But by then, like, there's a production crew attached to it, and there's sort of writers assigned to it, and there's editors who are excited about it, and there's photo teams, and so it sort of develops, and that's when it starts to get sort of really exciting and bubble up. But when you sort of let it out, as you are sort of getting to the final stages, all you can do is say, here's what I got, what do you think? Mm-hmm. And people either accept it or they don't, and you just sort of hope that they understand sort of the power of the possibility, and they understand. We came out on April 11th, and the night before there was a Cubs game on. It was the Cubs home season opener, and so they were doing drop-ins about the series in the game, right? And so Michael and Jamel were in Chicago for the SC6, so they had people from the show on the SC6. Like, you find ways for each element to work within the construct of each platform.
Mm-hmm. So, Libby, we've been talking about specific stories, but what about just like exploring a new medium? So it's like, 30 for 30 podcast. How does the evolution of that, how does it differ from what we talked about with the collaborative kind of evolution of a story?
Well, thank you for saying that. If I see a lot of you on your phones, if you could please close out and just subscribe to 30 for 30 podcast right now. I'm not calling you out, I just would like the subscription. They drop tomorrow, by the way. I think we've always are looking, and we talked a lot about sort of how the landscape of documentaries and long-form storytelling is growing and growing and growing. It seems like every network, every league has now some sort of sports storytelling arm. So as we think about, okay, we do short form. We've done short films 5 to 40 minutes long. We've done 1 and 2 hour films since the beginning of 30 for 30. Now, certainly a longer form, 7.5 hour film. So what's new and different, and how can we keep pushing ourselves and keep learning? And we're all podcast nerds in our office and have wanted to do this actually for 3 or 4 years. We've talked about doing it. We tried to do it internally. I actually remember walking home from work and listening to an existing 30 for 30, and I was like, oh, you can't just slap these. That's not how that works. I had no idea what was going on, no idea who was talking. It was a disaster. So We then realized we needed some audio experts, and we've hired actually 5 or 6 people from the podcast and audio space who really know that form of storytelling. So we have merged some of our best producers with that team who really who can say, we have this nugget, we have this story that we want to tell, now help us translate that, and they've done that. So we'll see. I mean, we're trying it out starting tomorrow, and I think for us, we've learned so much, which I think is really fun. It's really scary, but it's fun too. And then along the lines of what we've been talking about is I've never worked really closely with our team from ESPN Audio, who oversees all of our podcasting and our radio. So we've gotten to know them well. And I think it's important to know what you don't know, right? I know where I find my podcasts, I know what I like to listen to, but I have no idea how our little documentary team translates there. So where do we want to be? When do we want to be there? Someone said in a meeting, people are consuming podcasts on YouTube. And I was like, God, that sounds weird. And, I feel very old when I hear that. So we looked at our relationship with YouTube, and we created sort of a weird visual effect. And these are going to be on YouTube. And that was something, I had no idea was a place we'd be. I'm not sure that's going to be like an outrageous gangbuster number for us. But okay, that's different. And by the way, our audio team hadn't done that before either. So we're going to try it. So I don't know. I think it's not being afraid of, and none of these are huge financial risks either, which obviously makes things a little bit easier. But for us, it's like, how can we keep learning and trying different stuff? And I don't know, maybe people do listen to podcasts there. We'll find those people and be there too. So I just think you have to be nimble, and you have to be thinking about, well, we have to go to these people. We have to present ourselves. So we can't just be so precious of just being on TV if we're a documentary. We can't be so precious about just being on the ESPN app, but let's be where people are and try new things. And that's really worked for our group.
Allison, you're saying you're so cognizant of social and what's happening there, and here you are creating a print piece. How does it affect the storytelling with something like the body issue? In terms of that's a very visual package, but you still want to look for storytelling opportunities within that, and you want it to work in print, you want it to work digitally. How did you think through how to translate it for different platforms?
Sure. Well, for body is an interesting one because it's we're in our 9th year now. So year 1 was just convincing athletes to be that vulnerable and to participate in that kind of storytelling, and then over the course of the early years, which Chad can speak to a lot more, it became this incredible premium photography experience, and you end up with these images that are just so powerful. That by the time we got to last year, we're looking at them and we're saying, once you've seen 8 years of images, no matter how incredible, do you almost start to feel a sameness about it? Just because, there's this level of, beauty and, clearly, impossible to achieve, excellence, in the athletic form. We had embraced the idea that it was a photographic project to the degree that in the magazine there were no stories anymore. For the last few years, we really said body is about the images. So let's just go all in on that and just really show images. And then, we're looking at the way people actually consume body, and a lot of it is on digital. It's on your phone. So then we started saying, well, if that's really where people are going for photos, we also have to evolve the way that we're sharing those photos and the actual experience. So this year we're launching a digital visual experience on mobile that's very swipeable. It's going to be less about long stories on the mobile experience. It's more about, you get to see, all the photos for an athlete. You're swiping through. It's a pull quote. It's a behind-the-scenes video clip. It's a little snippet of storytelling. It's the kind of experience that you'd want to have in that specific form. Then you go back to the magazine and we say, did we almost swing the pendulum so far by embracing photos to that degree that we've lost sight of why we actually selected some of these athletes? The reason that a lot of these athletes decide to participate is because they have a story to tell. And if we don't really think that you're going to your phone to swipe through a long form body story, why don't we do the immersive visual experience on the phone? I'm like doing this because that's what we do on our phones. And then when you're in the magazine, it should be sort of the perfect marriage of the storytelling itself and the photos. So we actually have embraced across the entire magazine this year. It's all all body storytelling, including the front of the book, which we've never done before. So, we have stories that are in season and relevant to the other larger sports conversation happening, but every single feature story and front of book story is body this year. And then when you get to the body portfolio, we've got varying lengths of first person as told tos that are going to be woven in throughout the photo portfolio. And we really feel like for the magazine experience, that's the right balance. But as far as the social conversation goes, some folks have noticed already we are releasing, one by one who the athletes are who are on our covers this year. Because we know that there's a certain kind of social conversation and excitement that comes around whenever we release a cover image particularly. So having the athletes themselves share those covers, talk about those experiences, having the photographers talk about what went into capturing the images, this all feels like exactly the right conversation to be having on social. And then, this whole week we're doing Body Week on SportsCenter. So we've embraced a theme this year of every body has a story, and we chose 5 out of our 23 athletes that are getting SportsCenter feature treatment. So we know that when you're watching in that capacity, that's the right story to tell there. And then we'll have a different conversation over here and a different conversation over there. And hopefully it ends up being this full circle storytelling experience that really brings out the best of body.
We're going to take questions from the audience. We have a couple mics here on either side. But before we do that, Chad, I just want to ask, we were talking a little bit before about how do you harness, I think you said it's like 500 in terms of talent, 500 writers, producers, editors, news gatherers that you guys can deploy. And you guys have come up with a tool, I think of it as like, it's a top secret app. That you guys have that you now deploy. It changes the way you guys cover live events.
It's not top secret at all. It's a proprietary app that we have that sort of is downloaded onto the phones of all of our talent and producers and newsbreakers and analysts. And when they're in the field, they're filing short form storytelling in text, in video, in photo, directly back to us. And it goes, your first question was about, the trends that we're discovering in the marketplace. And the importance of live for everybody has never been more paramount. And what this form of storytelling allows us to do is to provide so much more expertise and content for anybody who's using an ESPN product, whether it be digital or on television. And because the talent we have is, amongst the greatest asset that we have at ESPN. And they know more than anybody else. They have better connections. They are in all the places. They can get the access. They can get the insight. They can get the storytelling. And those are sort of the tentpoles that in the digital space we talk about driving on a daily basis. And what these sort of short form nuggets, and you'll see them like if you go to ESPN.com or you're in the ESPN app, you notice these sort of self-contained modules that they're most prominent during what I talked about earlier, these live news windows. And that can be big events where it's a day of free agency, that can be breaking news, that can be a game that's happening on our air or anywhere else where we know sort of a conversation is coalescing. And those things are, nuggets of gold. And it changes the way we think about how we're communicating with our fans. It changes the way what we're offering them. But it also changes how we program, not just digitally, but what we're thinking about from a television perspective. Because, so much of what our teams are out there gathering is inaccessible to anybody else. We are behind the curtain when Kevin Durant is sort of dissing Russell Westbrook at the All-Star game, right? And you can't see that unless you're there, unless you have a pass, and unless you have a phone that's has an ESPN app on there that allows you to get this to the rest of the ESPN universe. Those are huge differentiators for us every day.
Well, I feel like it's also having that second piece of like the air traffic controller to then know what to do, where to plug in. That
and those are massive conversations, no different than sort of the regular cross-platform conversations we have.
Any questions from the audience? I'm blind to the mic, so if you do, let me know. I don't hear anything, so I'm going to go to Allison. One thing I think about with taking these stories and telling them in all these different places is, aren't you, kind of an obvious question, aren't you worried about cannibalizing the audience? So it's like, oh, they know some of the story or too much of the story. how much do you worry about it, and how much do you try to kind of hold back? So it's like, well, we will share 20% of the story, but we really want you to do the deep dive and read about like that amazing story about the soccer team that was recovering from the loss of all those players.
Yeah.
It's wrenching. You know, how do you think of it?
I feel like I can remember a time when we worried about stuff like that. You know, I want to say, 8-10 years ago, there were a lot of conversations about cannibalizing ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel like anybody thinks about that anymore, mostly because we think a lot about where our audience is. And all too often, or maybe not all too often, just the nature of our lives, you engage with media at the moment that you want to engage with it. You tend not to sit and consume 5 things all at once. So essentially, we want to be wherever people are at the moment that they want what we're offering. So I'm not really worried if television has a great feature on, what happened to that team in the wake, in that community in the wake of the plane crash.
Because E60 did their version of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So E60 has that, but there's a particular moment for viewers when they want to sit down and watch a feature like that on television. E60 airs on Sunday mornings, and then eventually that story will make it onto our digital platforms. But it's a totally different mindset, and it's a different moment in your life and your habits when you decide you want to sit down and read a 6,000-word story. Mm-hmm. It's a different kind of thing that you're choosing to welcome into your life. You may decide that story is so fascinating that you want to consume it in the other forms in which it exists. Mm-hmm. Or it may be that at the moment that you decided to read that story, that's exactly what you want. You may never even realize that we did the feature on television, and that's fine. But for the people who are looking for, long-form narrative video storytelling, they're going to want to watch a show that offers it to them in that way. They may have zero interest in reading about it, and that's also fine. But we would really be missing an opportunity to connect with people in the way that they want to connect if we decided that we were so concerned about our internal stuff that we chose to not do one of those versions because we thought, there might be some overlap.
Right. You say it's fine. I don't think it's fine because I think both pieces work really well on their own, so I recommend both. That's all the time we have today. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thanks so much to our panel.
Thanks, Doug.